What's the purpose of a Git command? It records changes to one or more files in your branch and serves it as a reference point in the repository's history. Yep. How would you define a Git branch? Generate a copy of a target repository, a directory or storage space where your projects can live, a pointer to a set of code changes that are independent from other branches. Yep. Which of the following is not a best practice when reviewing a pull request? Express why certain code should be changed, providing objective and non-judgmental feedback, only review the pull request description and glancing at the code. This one. Which of the following is not a best practice when submitting a pull request? Adding images to the pull request, making a pull request smaller, submitting a pull request with untested code, submitting a pull request with a brief and succinct description of the changes made. Yes, submitting a pull request with untested code. Complete the Git command steps in order to push code changes from your local repository to the remote repository on GitHub. This is very easy. So firstly, git add, git commit, git push, done. When is the best time to delete a branch? Once the pull request has been submitted and code merged, or if the code changes on the branch are no longer relevant. Yeah, this. Yep. What is the name of the starting branch? That's easy when creating a new GitHub repository. That's main. Okay, what are the major steps in the GitHub flow? So on the in the GitHub flow. Okay, so first the branch. When working with a specific branch, and then create pull request. No. Merge once. Commit changes and push code to the remote repository. Then create a pull request. Discuss pull request with reviewers. Merge bonds once pull request is accepted. Okay. What's the general process of reviewing a pull request? You read the pull request description. Share the pull request to the world. What? Don't think that. No. Comment on lines of code that need feedback. Submit review. Merge code. Add code to staging. Share the pull request to the world. Take a look again. Repeat if needed. Of reviewing a pull request. Merge, add code, take a look again. What are the steps in order to successfully create and merge a pull request? Create and merge a pull request. So submit pull request with description. So submit pull request with description. Make changes from feedback. Merge code. Done. Almost didn't know that one. Okay, so start informational. GitHub and Markdown. Why learn Markdown? Once we add our code to GitHub, how do we actually format the text in our repository? Technically, we could use plain text on everything. But if we wanted to highlight our project with code blocks, insert images into our project descriptions, or visually paste our documentation with headings, using Markdown on GitHub is the answer. With a little bit of Markdown magic, you can achieve text that includes headings, hyperlinks, emojis, check marks, and code blocks like the following file in our file Learn C++ repository. Okay, so this is just a repository in GitHub. It's got all the information of Markdown syntax. Let's move. Right, Mr. Carlos. Let's listen to what he says.
Let's talk about Markdown. What is Markdown? Why do we use it? And how does it actually work? So let's go ahead and jump right in. So what exactly is Markdown? Why do we use it? And how do we use it? Well, in simple terms, Markdown is a text-to-HTML conversion tool for web writers. So Markdown allows us to write using an easy-to-read, easy-to-write plain text format and then convert it structurally to valid HTML. With this definition, Markdown is essentially two things. One, it's a plain text formatting syntax, and two, it's a software tool that was written in Perl that converts plain text formatting to HTML. The overall design goal for Markdown's formatting syntax is to make it as readable as possible. So that allows us to create text that looks like this and transform it into this kind of output. Now, many of us have used different tools that allows us to format text in various different ways. So Microsoft Word is a great example of that. Let's look at how I would write some simple content using Microsoft Word. Now, Microsoft Word is very useful in providing us with various tools to actually format and edit our text. But a lot of times it may be overdoing it. Perhaps you just want to bold some text or make a simple list, and maybe you don't even want to open Microsoft Word to format a text that you're going to send as an email. Another tool that's used a lot, and it's the way web pages and email templates are coded so that text is formatted, is HTML. So let's see how we would write the same content using HTML. Now, HTML is pretty much used everywhere in the internet. It's also more expressive and can actually achieve some specific effects that may be difficult or impossible in Markdown. However, there's a learning curve to HTML, and similarly to Microsoft Word, its benefits really depend on what you're using it for. You can see in this example, you have to actually take into account the various different tags that HTML provides and make sure that they're all being closed properly. Now, this might be easy if you're experienced, but if you're a beginner and you just want to format a text like an email or certain documentation, it might be overboard and unnecessary to learn. So let's see how we would write the content from the previous two examples using Markdown. As you can see, Markdown syntax is comprised entirely of punctuation characters, which have been chosen carefully to look like what they mean. So asterisk around the word kind of represent emphasis, which bolds the text. Markdown lists look like, well, lists. Now, Markdown is not a replacement for HTML or even close to it. Its syntax is very small and it only corresponds to a very small subset of HTML tags. But the idea is not to create a syntax that makes it easier to insert HTML tags. The idea for Markdown is to make it easy to read, write, and edit prose. Due to this, Markdown's formatting syntax only addresses issues that can be conveyed in a plain text. So let's take a look at how we actually use Markdown to format and edit our text. For headings, we usually use a hashtag to represent what kind of heading we're going to be using. To create a heading, we usually add a hash in front of a word or phrase, and the number of hashes you use should correspond to the heading level. So if we want to create a heading level 3, we use 3 hashes. For different types of emphasis, we use other punctuation marks. If you want to italicize your text, you simply add an asterisk before and after the word. In order to bolden it, you add 2 asterisks before and after the word. And if you want to have some strike-through text, you simply wrap the text in tildes. For list items, we also have quite simple syntax we can use. To create an unnumbered list, you're given the option of using dashes, asterisks, or plus signs to put them in front of line items, and this will create a bulleted list. For ordered list, all we need to do is simply add line items with numbers followed by periods. Now the numbers don't have to be in numerical order, but the list should start with the number 1, and this would create a numbered list. So now that we have an idea of how Markdown is composed, let's dig in a little deeper and figure out how exactly it works. Now, Markdown is basically plain text, so it can be used pretty much anywhere. But in this case, let's assume you wrote a file that has some Markdown syntax. From there, you're going to make sure that you save it with an extension called .markdown or .md. Going from there, once you have your Markdown file, from there you actually need a Markdown application that's capable of processing the Markdown file. Now, Markdown applications use something called a Markdown processor, also commonly referred to as a parser or an implementation, that basically take the Markdown formatted text and output it to HTML format. Now, at that point, your document can be viewed in a web browser or combined with a style sheet and printed. And if you simply want to just experiment with Markdown, there's a bunch of Markdown editors online that you can simply look up and use Markdown with. So why should we use Markdown? Well, there are a few reasons for that. One of them is accessibility. Markdown is very accessible to someone who doesn't know the first thing about HTML. So let's look at an example where HTML can get quite nested and complex. As you can see here, there's a lot of boilerplate that we actually have to create before we even start writing the content of our text using HTML. Moreover, if we have a lot of content, it can get quite nested and it can be very hard to read, especially if you're not really familiar with HTML. This leaves us with a lot of room for error. HTML basically begs for typos, so even the smallest typo or mistake can completely alter and change the way our content looks. One of the other reasons we should use Markdown is that due to the way it's written, we can pretty much use it everywhere. For example, it's used widely in software documentation, particularly open source, because it enables richer formatting than plain text alone. Certain applications also support Markdown, so you can even format your text as Markdown within the application itself. Markdown has become so popular and common that even applications that you probably are familiar with use Markdown themselves. It's become the default or the standard for formatting certain types of text. So let's look at a few more examples as to where exactly Markdown is applicable. For starters, we can use it on websites. Markdown was designed for the web, so it should come as no surprise that there are plenty of applications specifically designed for creating website content. Now, although there are limitations for Markdown, if you're intending to write something with straightforward text like a blog, then Markdown might save you some time. Now, while Markdown doesn't have all the bells and whistles of word processors like Microsoft Word, it's very useful to creating documents and notes, and it's still very readable that you can actually copy and paste it elsewhere and still be able to format it as Markdown. Now, if you send a lot of emails and you're tired of the formatting controls available on most email provider websites, you'll be happy to know that there's a bunch of tools online that allow you to actually implement Markdown inside your email, making it very easy and readable to send emails with formatted text. Lastly, Markdown is a natural fit for technical documentation. Companies like GitHub are increasingly switching to Markdown for their documentation due to its ease of writing and reading the actual documents. So hopefully this video gave you a better understanding of what is Markdown and how it's actually used. Anyway, thank you all for watching. Join the conversation by subscribing to this channel or dropping a comment below. And if you want to take your skills to the next level, start learning on Codecademy today.
Thank you. Thank you, Carlos. Okay, Mr. Carlos. Okay, so that is Markdown. Let's move on. Okay, then there's an article here. What is Markdown? An alternative way to style text document for readability and portability. So I'm going to quickly read through it. Introduction. If you are looking for a simple way to create visually appealing text documents without using any fancy editors, check out Markdown. Invented by John Gruber and Oren Schwartz in 2004, Markdown provides a lightweight syntax to style any text document so that it can be converted to HTML for viewing and publishing. Okay. Differences between HTML and Markdown. Markdown translates to HTML, but Markdown is not a replacement for HTML. Markdown syntax can be converted to a small subset of HTML tags to do things like format text, add links, display images, and more. You can even incorporate HTML elements inside a Markdown document. To render Markdown in HTML, though, you would need a tool called Markdown Parser. More about this parser later on. Benefits of using Markdown. Why would you use Markdown? Compared to HTML, writing text in Markdown is much faster because the syntax is simpler. The authors of Markdown intended Markdown to be a language for writing styled text with syntax that is just as easy to read as it is to write. Imagine that we are writing down some important text on a sheet of paper. If we wanted to emphasize the text, we might underline it twice even. Similarly, in Markdown, we could write title of my document. Notice that we have plain text that has a row of equal signs to produce a first level header, also known as H1 tag, or just H1. On a web page, the heading will display as such. Really? The amount of equals don't matter so long as there's at least one and it goes under the text. For text that's important, but not as important as first level heading, we might just underline it once in code. We would use a row of hyphens, like so. Subtitle of my document. To produce a second level header, also known as H2, subtitle of my document. Okay. Both examples are valid Markdown text syntax. It is intuitive and normal for headings to be in either format. Alternatively, you can format headings using the hashtag character. We'll show more examples of different headings, but for now, here's an example of valid syntax for a H1 heading. Hashtag title of my document. Furthermore, a Markdown document without any HTML tags can be published as is because its syntax is already made for easy viewing. For example, the following Markdown document has styled a heading underlined with equal signs, emphasized weak in bold with double asterisks, bulleted a list by prefacing each item with a number and a period, and marked several lines as separate quotes with an angle brackets per quote, greater than per quote. Okay. So my to-do list at the end of this week, I plan to, okay, I see it. The HTML equivalent to the above would be, that's right. Interesting. When viewed on a Markdown parser such as stackedit.io, you will see this. My to-do list. At the end of this week, I plan to learn Markdown, write Markdown, share a Markdown note, my favorite quote. If you didn't get it the first time, do not despair, try and try again. So while both parsers take the same Markdown input, they render slightly differently. Different HTML based on their internal configurations and CSS. When to use Markdown? After knowing the many benefits of Markdown, you might want to consider using Markdown if you ever find yourself in any of these scenarios. The only editor available to right. The only editor available to use supports just plain text. So probably like a notepad. Then you can use Markdown, something like that. Time is of the essence, and you can't afford to learn how to use an unfamiliar rich text editor. You need to quickly outline your ideas in a structured but presentable manner. You want your document to be portable so that it can convert to HTML, PDF, EPUB, EPUB, and or MOBI. Markdown documents document extension. Contrary to popular belief, Markdown is not a document format. Therefore, it doesn't require a strict file extension naming convention, such as .md. As the official Markdown mailing list explains, Markdown isn't meant to take over the format of a file. Any file extension that you would normally use to name your text document, such as .txt or .text, is appropriate. However, organizations such as GitHub have a preference to expect Markdown documents to appear with an .md or .markdown extension. Markdown application. Since Markdown has gained a lot of popularity, you'll find Markdown content being accepted in many applications. Website publishers that accept Markdown content include WordPress.com, Ghost, and Beaker browser. Tools such as Jekyll, Docosaurus, MKDocs can convert Markdown documents into a static website geared for technical documentation. Take a look at this page rendered in HTML and its text source styled in Markdown. Book publishers such as Leanup accepts Markdown manuscripts and convert them to books for publication. Slideshow presentations such as Remark and Cleaver can convert Markdown slides into HTML for web viewing. The Markdown Parser. A Markdown parser is software written to parse the Markdown syntax in a text document and convert it into HTML syntax. The original Markdown parser was written in Perl, but you can find parse implementations today in almost any programming language, regardless. A basic Markdown parser should support the core Markdown syntax: paragraphs, headers, block quotes, phrase emphasis, lists, code, images, and links. There are Markdown parsers that are freely available on web, Stackit.io, Dillinger Parse, and Markdown to HTML Converter. In addition to parsing and rendering, both Parse and Markdown HTML Converter also convert the Markdown document to raw HTML so that you can copy and paste the HTML to be used elsewhere. Markdown tutorial. Let's learn a little more about the Markdown syntax. As mentioned above, you can simulate a H1 HTML tag with a hashtag Markdown symbol. Since there are 6 heading tags for HTML from H1 through to H6, you can simulate this with a hashtag through hashtag in Markdown. For example, this Markdown syntax. Okay, so one hashtag is H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6. Okay, that makes sense. We'll render this. In addition to numbered lists, you can style a bulleted list too. There are 3 different symbols you can use to mark a line item as a bullet: asterisk, plus sign, or hyphen. For example, Markdown HTML XML produces this. Okay. For best practice, it's recommended to use the same marker throughout your list instead of mixing them like above. The core Markdown syntax does not include nested list within another list, but it allows adding paragraphs between list items. To do so, you need to add a blank line after a list item and indent 4 spaces or 1 tab before starting a paragraph. Some parsers are lenient and do not enforce 4 spaces, but there should be some spacing. So asterisk Markdown. Markdown is lightweight markup language for styling text. HTML stands for hypertext markup language. Yep. Mastering Markdown. Mastering Markdown. In this article, you will learn how to